everyone, this is Glenda Carmack, and today I'm going to be talking about macro photography. Macro photography is close-up photography. This is where you take images of small objects and try to fill the frame with the object. And not only are we going to be talking about photographing small objects, I'm also going to show you a setup that will help you photograph the object even better. Now, I have used this for scientific specimens, but it will also work for any object that you need to hold in light to get a really good image of the object. So, let's get started. This is an image of a sweet william. And if you know what a sweet william is, it is a flower that's about the size of a dime. And when I took this image, it looks like there's an ant on the flower. But if you look really close, this really isn't an ant. It is a spider ant. It is a particular type of spider that looks like an ant in order to fool its predators. Here in this even closer view of the spider ant, you can really see the differences between an ant and the spider ant. Notice that it has 8 legs instead of 6. A while back, a professor came to me and asked me if I could help him photograph a dog skull and a deer skull that they had found doing their field research in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This particular professor specializes in myxomycetes, which is a type of slime mold. They discovered these skulls, and they also discovered that there was slime mold growing on the skull. So not only did we have to photograph the skull, but we needed to do macro photography, come in really close and photograph the plasmodial tracks found on the skull and around the teeth. So this is my picture of the skull, and I'm going to show you how I set up and stage the area to take these pictures. This is one of the close-up shots of the skull showing the plasmodial tracks that the professor needed to document. Notice that the tooth practically fills the frame. This was probably taken at a 3:1 magnification. With macro photography, you have to get very, very close to the subject. But since this was a skull, it was very difficult for me to hold the skull in place, so I had to discover a solution that would allow me to hold the skull and get it at the angle I needed to take the macro image. So today I'm sharing with you a pretty inexpensive setup that allows you to hold objects of unusual shapes and sizes in place to allow you to do close-up photography. So the first thing that you want to do in your macro setup is to find a staging area. Now this can just be a small table next to a wall, or in my case I had a computer cart with an upper and lower shelf. What I then did was go to the local discount store and bought a couple of yards of some inexpensive black fabric. When I worked on the table, I was able to tape the fabric to the wall so that it would be held up behind the specimen, or when I was working on the computer cart, I clamped it to the top of the cart. The next stop I made was over in the houseware sections, where I bought an inexpensive Lazy Susan and a glass pie plate. So now I need to fill the pie plate with a substance that's going to hold my object in place even when it doesn't have a flat bottom. And what I came up with is table salt. It's really inexpensive and I can use it over and over. I bought a couple of big boxes, and I bought an inexpensive plastic pitcher that I can put the salt back in when I'm through with the setup. You're going to want to fill the pie plate with enough salt so that you can hold the object and move it around and get it at the angle you need. So put a good 2 or 3 inches in there. You don't want it so that it's flowing out of the top, but you you do want to be able to move the salt around and mold it to the form of the object so it will hold it in place. Next, I found a couple of inexpensive desk lamps that had posable necks so that I could move and position the light exactly where I needed. I replaced the bulbs that came with the desk lamps with specialty bulbs that I had bought online. These bulbs not only remain cool, which is really important when you have light close to the area, but they're also daylight balanced, which means that they're going to be the right color and not real yellow like most incandescent bulbs will put off a yellow light. So this gave me a better light source than regular incandescent lights, and they stayed cooler, which allowed me to work longer without having to shut the lights off to have them cool down. Now that the macro stage is set up, we need to get the camera and get it set up. One of the biggest issues with macro photography is establishing enough depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of the subject that is in focus, and the closer you get to something, the more shallow the depth of field. So in order to compensate for the shallow depth of field, you need to use a small aperture to increase the amount of the field that is in focus. However, when you use a small aperture, you have to have a longer shutter speed in order to get proper exposure. So it is very difficult to handhold a camera in a macro situation. So you're going to want to set it on a tripod. You're also going to want to set it up so that you have a remote trigger to fire the shutter. In my situation, the Canon camera that I use has a USB cord that connects to a laptop, and I was able to use software to set my camera, to fire the trigger, and to save the images directly to the desktop. Now this really saved a lot of time and effort because I didn't have to take the flash card out of the camera, transfer the images to the laptop to see what I had. I was able to see my image immediately and make my adjustments as needed. If I needed to move the light or if I needed to fine-tune the focus, because in macro photography, slightest little increments can make a big difference. This situation works for more than just the skull. I was able to take pictures of the fungus growing on this rock that was glued to a piece of board. The salt was able to hold the board in place, and I was able to bring my subject into focus and get a very detailed picture of the fungus growing on this rock. In this image, I am focusing the camera as it sits on the tripod. Notice how close the lens is to the object, the skull that I am photographing. In macro photography, you are really close to the subject. Sometimes the lens almost blocks light from getting to the subject. So it's real important that you have these lights that you can bend at angles and help get light to the field so that you can get a really good image without having to have too long of an exposure. Once I have the object in focus, I go to the laptop, which is now controlling some of the features of the camera. Via the laptop, I am able to set the aperture, the shutter speed, and get a large preview of the image after it has been taken. And it's really important in macro photography that you see that you have the sharp focus that you need. The tiny little 2-inch screen on the back of your camera does not give you enough detail to determine whether enough of the object is in focus. So whenever possible, use file transfer via the USB port to the computer so that you can determine if the focus is suitable for the image that you are taking. Notice that even though the skull is very awkwardly shaped and I had to turn it upside down, I was still able to stabilize the skull and hold it in place with the salt that is in the pie dish. It does a really good job of stabilizing the skull so that I can get a really good image of the plasmodial fields that are growing on the skull. Here is the complete macro setup. The camera is on a tripod and it is attached to the laptop through a USB cord. I am now able to control all the functions of the camera through the laptop. I can set aperture and exposure. I can also trigger the camera through the laptop. This is really important in macro photography because the slightest little vibration can cause your image to look not as sharp. So you can reduce vibration by not having to actually depress the shutter on the camera and actually use the laptop to take the image. So the laptop can control most of the functions of the camera, but it is not a live preview. You only see the image after it has been taken. All focusing still has to be done through the viewfinder. This setup is really great for macro photography. It is also great for doing small objects. Notice in this image I have the fabric over the container holding the salt. I'm still able to position the skull and hold it in place without seeing the field and able to get a really good image of the skull. Here is an image of the skull. Notice how I have turned it on its side but was still able to hold the skull firmly in place in order to get a really nice picture of the skull. So that is my macro photography setup for scientific specimens. I hope today that you were able to learn some tips and techniques that will help make your macro photography setup a successful one in the future.